Hello and welcome back to Anthology of Heroes, the podcast sharing stories of heroism and defiance throughout history. Anthology of Heroes is part of the Evergreen Podcast Network. I'm your host, Elliot Gates, and you've just tuned into part 2, the final part of our series on the Great Irish Famine. In part 1 of our story, we blinked through about 800 years of Anglo-Irish history. Beginning with William the Conqueror's invasion in 1066, we watched as the two countries, once very similar, began to diverge, with England effectively becoming Ireland's overlord by the 17th century. As England expanded economically and militarily, Ireland was increasingly oppressed as British public opinion turned against it. The Irish were stereotyped as lazy, backward drunks, an enormous leech on the British Empire that was sucking it dry through welfare. Irish Catholics, who made up the majority of the country, saw their civil rights heavily restricted. They couldn't join the army, sit for government, or even own land. By the 18th century, they were little better than slaves. As a shocked visitor would remark of them, quote, "These poor creatures are in virtual bondage to their landlords and superiors, as is possible for mind and body to be. They cannot work unless they bid them, they cannot eat unless they feed them, and they cannot get away unless they help them." Our story today begins with the woman who wrote the lines above. Asenath Nicholson was an American philanthropist who, driven by faith, chose to walk across Ireland, helping people in any way she could. Asenath, though a devout Protestant, admired the Irish character. As a kind of aesthetic herself, she appreciated their cheerful nature, hard work, and enduring faith. But across the Irish Sea, Sir Charles Trevelyan, a British public servant, had a very different view of the Irish. As assistant to the Treasury, he was the one responsible for deciding how much money and food was provided for Ireland, and Charles Trevelyan was not a charitable man. Trevelyan believed, as did most members of British Parliament, in the doctrine of laissez-faire, that is, minimal government interference in the private market. If an individual had the means to make a profit, nothing should stop him from doing so, even if that profit came from price gouging starving families. Trevelyan held strong anti-Irish views, seeing the people as inherently lazy and arrogant. He believed they depended too heavily on British aid, putting the country at risk of becoming a welfare state the British Crown would ultimately have to support. This had led him to spearhead a series of government policies and acts designed to make food and aid much harder to attain. One of the victims of Trevelyan's policies was Roger MacDonald and his family. Roger was a Catholic farmer from Erris, a little barony on the wild western fringes of the country. He and his family got by, farming just half an acre of potatoes for his landlord, but once the blight destroyed his potatoes, he was forced onto welfare to keep his family alive. Trevelyan's harsh policies had pushed his family to the brink. Already having lost one daughter to the famine, he, his wife and children worked long, hard days on the roadside, breaking stones for gruel. These are just the main characters. In part 1, we also covered the specifics like laws, policies, history, and how the blight came to affect Ireland. All these are integral to understanding how this situation came to be, so I'd really recommend you start with that one first. In this episode, we delve into the darkest years of the famine. Prime Minister Robert Peel is out, replaced by Lord John Russell, who grants Trevelyan even more freedom in managing Irish famine relief. As Ireland shivered through one of its harshest winters, Trevelyan's ruthless cost-cutting tightens the noose. In desperation, the Quakers step in, feeding thousands and revolutionizing soup kitchens across the country. While Asenath Nicholson opens a Dublin apartment to the starving, landlords are lynched and Protestant priests force desperate Catholics to convert for a bowl of soup. If you've enjoyed the first episode, please take a moment to rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Ratings from you. Yes, you. Ratings help the show attract new listeners, and it just takes a few seconds. As a warning, this episode contains some pretty graphic first-hand accounts of pain and suffering, including children. Let's jump into it. The Great Hunger Part 2, Exodus. In his Dublin office, Randolph Routh ran his hands over his bald head, massaging his temples as he stared at Trevelyan's letter. 5 times he'd reread the letter now, but no matter how many times he looked over it, he couldn't make sense of it. As head of the Famine Relief Commission, Routh was responsible for managing relief efforts in Ireland, and Trevelyan, his boss, had given him a troubling directive. Routh opened his desk drawer and poured himself a generous measure of whiskey, contemplating his next move. He knew what he had to do, really. It was fairly simple, but Routh knew doing so would have catastrophic consequences for the nation he was supposed to be caring for. Trevelyan's letter was an order for Routh to cease all charitable operations, essentially to stop feeding the poor. Warm and safe in his Dublin office, Routh was removed from the extreme poverty of the country, but he was well aware that people were suffering. He'd already forwarded numerous reports from priests and administrators detailing the starvation and desperation that was spreading through the countryside. Knowing how Trevelyan was, he hadn't anticipated an increase in funding, but he'd never expected a complete halt on relief efforts. He reread the letter for a final time, quote, "Whatever may be done hereafter, these things should be stopped, or you run the risk of paralyzing all private enterprises and having a country rely on you for an indefinite number of years." Routh swallowed as he read the word "you," knowing full well it was a thinly veiled threat. If Trevelyan's orders were not followed, the fault would be Routh's, and Routh's alone. As an ex-military man, Randolph Routh had been well positioned to head famine relief in Ireland. He'd worked all over the world with British Army supply units, and that's why the ex-Prime Minister, Robert Peel, had nominated him to organise distribution of personnel, supplies and aid to the famine areas. Since Peel's departure, though, there'd been precious little to distribute. Lately, Routh felt more of a glorified mailman, forwarding the increasingly bleak reports from the countryside onto Westminster. He knew Trevelyan was a colder man who disapproved of charity, but this letter shocked him to the core. Without aid, tens of thousands of people, perhaps more, would die. But Trevelyan didn't see it that way. In his letter, he provided yet another meticulously detailed plan, a rolling series of schemes and laws to raise capital domestically in Ireland, a strategy that Routh had already explained to him did not work. If Westminster did not provide food, the Irish would starve. No cleverly worded bills or gotcha clauses would change that. Shaking his head, Routh took a gulp of whiskey and began penning letters to regional distribution centres, telling them to shut shop and wind up relief efforts.
When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
In the rainy, ramshackle streets of Dublin, Asenath Nicholson walked briskly through the back streets. It was just after 9 a.m, but she'd been up since 4. As usual, she'd risen early with a mountain of tasks to accomplish before the day's end. When the famine had worsened, Asenath had relocated to Dublin from the countryside. Her move back to the capital had been a prudent one. From here, letters travelled much faster back to America, and she'd been sending letters, lots of them. Asenath had leveraged every contact, connection, or friend of a friend to help Ireland. To the richer ones, she'd requested money, and to the well-connected ones, she'd asked for publicity, for her pleas to be published in newspapers. And you can still feel her passion in these letters almost 200 years later. To a friend in London, she name-drops a famous abolitionist, asking why there were none dedicated to the Irish cause with the same vigour. Quote, "Where is your George Thompson, he who shook the United States from Maine to Georgia in pleading long and loud for the downtrodden black man? Can he not, will he not lift his voice for poor Ireland? She who stands shivering, sinking on the isthmus, must she, shall she die? Will proud England lose so bright a gem as Ireland might have been in her crown?" Another one of her letters, published in the New York Tribune, called upon Irish expats living abroad, quote, "It is to the Irish men and Irish women of New York I would speak on behalf of your bleeding, dying country, where you drew your first breath and spent your young, laughing days. Here, bear, for God's sake, for Christ's sakes, and for your brethren's sakes, bear, I pray. You have heard the sad wail across the Atlantic that her land is laid waste, and that here long, long oppression has at length filled up the cup of her miseries. It is full, it is running over. Hundreds are dying by the highway, in the fields, and in their cabins." With all the fire and fury of her Puritan preacher, she continues, quote, "Shame, a government that will give men 10 pence for a day of labour when Indian meal is 2 shillings. Shame, a nobleman with a pack of hunting hounds chasing some timid deer of mountain and glen, while 50 or 100 starving men are digging his ditches. Shame, the suppliced clergyman with a living of some thousands a year who pays a trusty servant from 4 to 6 guineas a year. Talk not of shame to any such. You who have lived in Ireland under their despotism may tell the Americans better." As the grey Dublin sunrise crept over the horizon, Asenath wiped sweat from her brow as she hauled the heavy sacks from the delivery carriage into her small apartment. With the proceeds from her vegan health book she sold back in America, Asenath had bought as much Indian corn as she could to feed the starving Dubliners while she wrote her letters. In her cramped, leaky apartment overlooking the Liffey River, she spent the mornings writing her new book about her travels in Ireland, and the evenings cooking a thin gruel, hoping to feed as many as she could with what little she had. When a contact of hers in New York had come through with an enormous shipment of Indian grain, she ripped up the carpets of her apartment and converted one of the rooms into a storage shed, while in the other lived a poor family she'd taken in from the streets, and in her own room, an orphan girl who Asenath was teaching to sew. On her morning errands, crowds would gather behind her, pleading for food. It broke her heart, but she had no choice but to ignore them. She had already stretched her cooking to the limit. To try and feed more would mean risking the survival of those she'd already committed to helping. She was just one person. Asenath knew it was unchristian, ungodly to hate, but her feelings towards Dublin's upper class tested even her. That very morning she'd seen something that had nearly made her sick. In one of the filthy back streets she'd come across an old crone, stirring a cauldron with a few sad potatoes bobbing in it. Floating in between them was the body of a half-starved dog. Not 20 minutes later on that same walk, she had to jump out of the way of horse-drawn carriages carrying lords and ladies from the grand Dublin ballroom. The annual celebration was one of the most anticipated events of the year, and this time was no different. Inside the ballroom there were no signs of the famine ravaging the country. Laughter and cheers filled the air. Sequin gowns shimmered under chandeliers, champagne flowed freely, and venison was served in abundance. Each person inside completely indifferent to the suffering that was happening just beyond the ballroom walls. Asenath was not the only one sharing the real story of the Irish plight. News of the dying country had made its way across the developed world, the 19th century equivalent of going viral. The Irish diaspora of America, spurred on by letters like the ones Asenath had been writing, pressured their government to do more, and private citizens all across the US began to donate in kind. Citizens from all walks of life gave what they could, but perhaps the most touching was a donation from the Choctaw Nation of the Native Americans. If you've listened to our episode on the Seminoles, you might remember that the Choctaws were one of the tribes ejected from their homeland and forcibly marched west in an event known as the Trail of Tears. Despite this catastrophic event nearly eradicating their tribe, the Choctaw people managed to pull together $170 and send it across the Atlantic to County Cork. A more surprising donation came from the Ottoman Sultan, Abdul Mesid. If you've listened to our episode on the Great Siege of Malta, you might remember the Ottoman Empire as a massive and powerful force. But by 1846, it was in serious decline. Even so, this distant power with no knowledge or relations to Ireland donated an incredibly generous £1,000. This donation comes with a bit of an interesting backstory that I should call out I've not been able to validate. As the tale goes, the Ottoman Sultan initially wanted to send £10,000, but was denied by the British ambassador, who said that because Queen Victoria was planning to donate £2,000, it would be a bad look for a foreign ruler to donate more than the reigning monarch. Still, wishing to do more, the Sultan then arranged to send about 4 ships full of grain to Ireland. There does seem to be some evidence that these ships actually arrived, but it's nothing definitive. What is definitive is that people really did care, and while many had no connection to Ireland, citizens from many different countries pooled what they had. One person who didn't, though, was, you guessed it, Charles Trevelyan. Trevelyan held firm to his principle of rejecting charity, but as donations poured in, the pressure mounted for him to act. Reluctantly, and after voicing his objections yet again, he contributed a miserly £25, a gesture as stingy as something you'd expect from Mr. Burns or Scrooge. In Parliament, he continued to rally against the British giving anything to Ireland. Throwing the blame at Peel's feet, he accused the ex-Prime Minister of the mortal sin of disrupting private industry. There was no more grain to come. He was going to make sure of that. Not only that, he had directed the civil servants in the poorhouses of Ireland to turn away all but the utterly destitute. Requesting or begging food is a last resort, something no one does unless they're completely desperate. Waiting for hours in line for a bowl of gruel was deeply humiliating to Irish families whose sense of pride was tied to their standing in the community. Yet now, once they reached the front of the queue, they risked being turned away because they were not poor enough. Ragged figures shuffled forward, their tattered clothes hanging loosely from gaunt frames, eyes glassy with hunger. After hours, one man would finally reach the administrator, who barely glanced at him. "Name?" the administrator would ask, not looking up for his notes. "Sean O'Malley," one would whisper. "Not on the list. This food is for the poor. Move along." With no strength left to argue, he'd turn and walk away, the distant sound of the ladle and soup slopping out for someone luckier than he. A skilled orator, Trevelyan's tone in Parliament began to shift. He could no longer ignore the widespread evictions happening across the country. The evidence for those was overwhelming. So instead, he started to support these land clearings, framing them as a step towards what the government was now calling high farming, large industrial scales operated with modern machinery. That, he insisted, was not just best for Britain, but for Ireland too. Quote, "For our parts, we regard the potato blight as a blessing. When the Celts once ceased to be potato-phagi, meaning potato eaters, they must become carnivorous. With the taste of meats, we'll grow an appetite for them. With this will come steadiness, regularity, and perseverance." But while Trevelyan spoke of progress from the comfort of Westminster, the harsh reality of his policies were being felt all across Ireland. In the midst of this devastation, the artist Daniel MacDonald captured the human cost in his painting titled "An Irish Peasant Family Discovering the Blight of Their Store." MacDonald's painting is special, holding the distinction of being the only piece of famine art painted during the famine. In his painting, a family uncovers their ruined potato crop. A father kneels in the dirt holding a withered potato. The mother clutches their youngest child while their older children stand nearby, shoulders slumped in despair. Behind them, dark clouds gather on the horizon. The British public, when viewing this artwork, were forced to confront the harsh realities that their government had imposed on their Irish brethren. The scene depicted men and women, just like them, who had the rotten luck of being born in Ireland rather than England. But for me, the most poignant artwork I've found for the famine is the black and white print, The Ejectment. In this one, the artist captures the turmoil of an eviction. The scene shows an Irish family being dragged away from their crumbling hovel. Soldiers rip the thatch from their roof and smash the walls. A mother and daughter plead for mercy from a callous, overweight commissioner perched atop a black horse. Meanwhile, the husband is being dragged out of his burning house as his 2 daughters weep beside a pile of wooden furniture tossed outside. Writing several decades later, Irish poet William Ailingham wrote The Eviction. It's one of those poems you really get goosebumps reading. I'll read out a part of it here, but you can find the full link to the poem on our website. Try and close your eyes as you picture Roger MacDonald and his family being subjected to something like this. Quote, "Halt! At the door they form in double line, and ranks of polished rifles wetly shine. The sheriff's painful duty must be done. He begs for quiet, and the work's begun. The strong stand ready, now appear the rest, girl, matron, grandsire, baby on the breast, and Rosie's thin face on pallet borne, a motley concourse, feeble and forlorn. One old man, tears upon his wrinkled cheek, stands trembling on a threshold, tries to speak. In defect of any word for this, mutely upon the doorpost prints a kiss. Through the crowd the children run bewildered, wailing loud. When needed most, the men combine their aid, and last of all is Una's forth conveyed. Reclined in her accustomed straw chair, her aged eyelids closed, her thick white hair. Escaping from her cap she feels the chill, looks around and murmurs, and then again is still. Now bring the remnants of each household fire, on the wet ground the hissing coals expire. And Pordine Du, with meekly dismal face, receives the full possession of the place." Pordine Du, from what I understand, is Irish slang for someone with low morals. The extract above described a legal eviction. So can you imagine how an illegal one went? Well, we've got an account of that too. Perhaps the most infamous eviction in the entirety of the famine took place under the orders of one Mr. Blake, whose cruelty shocked even the most callous lords of Westminster. Former Prime Minister Robert Peel brought the following report before Parliament, where it was read aloud. Quote, "It would appear from the evidence recorded that the forcible ejectment's work is illegal, that previous notices had not been served and the ejectments were perpetrated under circumstances of great cruelty. The time chosen was, for the greater part, nightfall on the eve of the new year. The occupiers were forced out of their houses with their helpless children and left exposed to the cold on a bleak western shore in a stormy winter's night. That some of the children were sick, that the parents implored that they might not be exposed and their houses left till the morning, that their prayers for mercy were in vain, and that many of them have since died. I have visited the ruins of these huts, not any great distance from Mr. Blake's residence. I found that many of these unfortunate people were still living in the ruins of these huts, endeavouring to shelter themselves under a few sticks and sods, all in the most wretched state of destitution. Many were so weak that they could scarcely stand when giving their evidence. The site of these ruins is a rocky wild spot, fit for nothing but a sheep walk." Perhaps it's reports like these ones that led Prime Minister Russell to try and push through a bill aimed at preventing such cruel evictions. Unfortunately, by this point, he was no longer just arguing with Trevelyan. A powerful group of Irish absentee landlords had grabbed onto this notion of high farming. Lord Palmerston was perhaps the most powerful of them. Palmerston was almost the British Empire embodied in human form. He was a staunch nationalist who worked hard to put Britain first in trade, wars, and world affairs. And many of the policies he put in place helped the British Empire lead the world for decades after his death. And little old Ireland was not about to stand in his way. Palmerston and his gang tore apart Russell's bill. Once it had ran the gauntlet through their challenges, the bill was almost completely useless. By the time it passed into law, the only real change was that landlords couldn't take the roofs off people's houses while they were still inside or evict people at night. Not exactly significant progress. Government policy had now warped from the Irish should pay for their own charity to when the Irish are gone, or when there's less of them, we can resettle the land and make it more prosperous. A cull of animals, surplus that needed to be disposed of. For the public servants on the ground, though, it was becoming harder and harder to stomach the effect these policies had on their communities. Edmund Wynne, a government administrator of West Clare, and previously something of a lackey of Trevelyan's, was both saddened and sickened as he watched a horde of vagabonds descend upon a field. Quote, "I confess myself unmanned by the extent and the intensity of the suffering that I have witnessed more, especially amongst the women and little children, crowds of whom were to be seen scattered over the turnip fields like flocks of starving crows, devouring the raw turnips, mothers half naked and shivering in the snow and sleet, uttering exclamations of despair while their children were screaming with hunger. All across Ireland, crime and theft skyrocketed, and those who were caught were punished harshly. The now famous rugby ballad, Fields of Athenry, tells the story of a couple forced into a life of crime from hunger. Quote, "By a lonely prison wall, I heard a young girl calling, 'Michael, they've taken you away, for you stole Trevelyan's corn, so the young might see the morn. Now a prison ship lies waiting in the bay.'" The song goes back and forth between the perspective of a husband to a wife, and concludes with Michael being sentenced to transportation to Australia. By a lonely harbour wall, she watched the last star falling, as that prison ship sailed out against the sky, for she lived in hope and pray for her love in Botany Bay. It's so lonely round the fields of Athenry. The people of Ireland had become the meat in a sandwich. They were caught in between the government's demands for landlords to make payments and the same landlords to evade those payments. Trevelyan, in an effort to eliminate waste, set forth another new series of directives. He figured, why should peasants be paid for a day's work if during that day there was no objective completed? Why, that was as bad as giving them money for nothing. Trevelyan replaced daily wages with task-based payments. For a labourer, this would mean you'd now get paid per metre of road completed or per buckets of stones broken. As you can guess, this policy was not popular. It was despised by not just the workers themselves, but the civil administrators. There just weren't enough supervisors and foremen to micromanage everything to the extent Trevelyan expected. The changes meant now that before payment could be issued, work needed to be inspected. And as the backlog for these inspections grew and grew, hundreds died from starvation, waiting to be paid for work they'd already done. Men and women who spent precious calories performing Trevelyan's back-breaking labour now had to wait for one of Trevelyan's bean counters to tick a box before they could eat. One man confessed to his priest that he hadn't eaten a full meal in 12 days. He died a few hours after. As the leaves withered and fell, one of the harshest winters in living memory gripped the dying country. Villages and towns emptied, their streets silent, while the graveyards grew crowded with the dead. Trevelyan, however, welcomed the harsh winter, noting that many tasks assigned to the masses couldn't be completed in the snow, which meant he wouldn't need to issue pay. Overworked supervisors, already loathed by the starving people they managed, faced an impossible situation. These clerks who were witnessing the miseries the mothers, fathers and children were facing felt deep revulsion, and many broke the law to help. While it's unclear on what scale this took place, records show that Trevelyan's administrators adjusted work ledgers to suggest tasks were still being completed, allowing people to receive their pay. But when the blizzard set in, these deceptions became untenable. Trevelyan's beady eyes scrutinized every document that crossed his desk. Any discrepancies triggered harsh investigations, and he punished those involved to the fullest extent of the law. But just like the kindly administrators, there were also Irish landlords that went against the grain. Major Charles O'Hara was one of them. The O'Hara family were of ancient Irish descent, and one of the few who had managed to keep their land from being seized by Cromwell centuries ago. And Charles, as the head of this rare lineage, stood as a remarkable example of selflessness. He travelled to Liverpool to secure what little grain and flour remained, and he paid out of pocket to bring it back to his county. But he didn't stop there. After hiring local women to cook and prepare, he was dismayed to see that few knew how to cook anything except potatoes. Writing to a friend of his, a fellow landlord, he swapped ideas on how to best keep the people alive. Quote, "I am now busied in establishing 4 soup shops on different works, so as to enable the labourers to get a warm meal of soup or hot porridge at a cheap rate, a halfpenny for a pint of soup or porridge." He goes on to say with pride that he'd taught many peasants to cook, ending with, quote, "My working party amounts to near 1,500 men daily, who consume 12 tons a week of meal." O'Hara's heavily subsidised meals were a literal lifeline to the people of Sligo, and it goes to show that there were those people out there at all levels of society that spent their own money, their own time, to to keep the country alive. O'Hara's letter touched on a question that many charitable groups grappled with: how to feed a population swiftly and cheaply. As we saw in episode 1 of this series, bringing in unprocessed grains wasn't practical, nor was importing massive amounts of raw flour to bake bread. This was at its core a mathematical challenge, requiring large-scale organisation efforts to solve. While the British government showed little interest in innovation, there was one group willing to take up the mantle: the Quakers. The Quakers, who you might recognise from the name of a box of breakfast oats, are a Christian religious society. Though deeply committed to their faith, they're not bound by rituals or traditions. Instead, they believe in this inner light that radiates from each person, a guiding presence of God that drives their actions. Though deeply anti-Catholic in rhetoric, it didn't matter. These people were Christians in the truest sense of the word, and were far more dedicated to Christ's message of charity rather than getting bogged down in politics. And it was they who would turn out to be one of Ireland's greatest allies in their time of need. The Quakers were particularly well positioned to help because they weren't just a bunch of aesthetic monks, they were industrialists and people of the community, mayors, parliamentarians, business tycoons, all well-connected people with deep pockets. Lone parliamentarians could easily be ignored, but a lobby group full of rich philanthropists? Well, that was harder to silence. The Quakers' first move was to travel to Ireland themselves and validate the rumours and headlines they'd been hearing about. But what they saw was far worse than anything they could have imagined. Workhouses, which had remained largely hidden from public view, were finally exposed, revealing appalling conditions. The Quakers learnt that it was an old trick for parents to pretend their children were orphans so the children would get into the children's ward and be fed quicker. Little did the parents know the children's ward were usually far worse than the adult equivalent. The Cork workhouse, for instance, had beds for 24 boys. 150 slept there. Food allocation was far too low, and many of the boys showed signs of prolonged starvation. Children as young as 8 or 9 had the appearance of old men with deep wrinkles and thinning hair. The floor in one room ran with raw sewage, a stench so vile that the doctors refused to enter it out of fear for their own health. One Mr. Stevens found in the workhouse in Bantry, on the southwest coast of the country, conditions even worse, writing with revulsion, quote, "Such an appalling, awful, and heart-sickening condition as it presented I have never witnessed or could think possible to exist in a civilized Christian community. Living and dead were lying together in the same beds. 40 children had died during the previous week." These filthy workhouses became epicenters for all range of diseases: bloody flux, relapsing fever, dysentery, and smallpox, to name a few. After catching the diseases inside, the sufferers would then carry them on to different areas as they roamed about looking for food. The Quakers realized it was imperative to feed these people where they lived, or as close to it as possible. And the concept they came up with is something we still use regularly today: the soup kitchen. The idea of providing soup to the poor was nothing new. Everyone understood that broth with a few vegetables and grains was cheaper than importing livestock. But it was the Quakers, with their business acumen, who were the first to implement relief efforts on an almost industrial scale. Very quickly they got to work, acquiring 290 large cast iron vats and distributing them all across the country. As they went, they refined their recipes, experimenting with ingredients to create a formula that both met the caloric needs of the starving peasants while remaining affordable. Historian Tim Coogan notes that at its peak, a single soup kitchen in Dublin was producing over 2,200 litres of soup daily. As volunteers ladled the steaming soup into rough metal plates, Quakers in America and England pulled together an astounding £200,000 to keep the kitchens running. Using their influence across the country, the Quakers pressured the government to abandon their laissez-faire approach, poignantly stating, quote, "When famine stares you in the face, political economy should be forgotten." Unfortunately, not all charity groups were as noble as the Quakers. If there's one thing you know about the Irish famine, I dare say it's souperism. As soup kitchens spread across Ireland, some Protestant groups saw the famine as an opportunity to pull the Irish away from their Catholic faith. A few bad actors among them would only provide soup to those who renounced Catholicism and converted to Protestantism. According to author Susan Campbell Bartoletti, writer of Black Potatoes, sometimes potential converts were offered new clothes or as much soup as they could carry in exchange for eating beef or bacon on Friday, a sin in Catholicism. One story I always heard about the famine was that some Protestant priests also demanded that potential converts drop the O from their surname. Irish surnames often begin with O, as in O'Haggerty or O'Brien, and removing the O meant stripping away a key part of their Irish identity. The story around the O surnames I've had trouble verifying, but incidents of souperism, demanding conversion in exchange for soup, did occur, though were much less common than I initially believed. Even though these events were rare, the fear it instilled was powerful enough to keep many families wary of accepting aid, even as starvation loomed. This deep mistrust of charitable acts that came with strings attached contrasted sharply with groups like the Quakers, who gave generously with no expectation of receiving anything in return. The Quakers remain deeply appreciated in Ireland to this very day, and within a few months, soup kitchens across Ireland were managing to feed an astonishing 3 million people daily. While Dubliners were kept alive with bowls of soup, there were few places in the world more miserable than the barony of Erris. Asenath Nicholson had made her way out to the western fringes to meet a friend of a friend, William Butler. Butler was not the type of person Asenath usually made time for. He served as a governor for the British Crown in the west of Ireland, and she was wary of the elite, especially those representing the British government. However, her contracts had praised his character, and the stern philanthropist found their assessment to be accurate. Butler had willingly taken on this thankless role in a genuine attempt to make a positive impact on the lives of the Irish people. To her, he expressed his sorrow over the state of the country and used whatever means he had at his disposal to try and improve the conditions for those under his care. While Asenath was still disheartened by the suffering around him, she recognized that this man was doing his best with the extremely limited resources he had at his disposal. His heart was in the right place. Butler had insisted to Asenath that she need to visit Erris. The place got few visitors, especially now, and Butler wanted to ensure their suffering wasn't forgotten. So he arranged transport, and he and Asenath were ferried over. Butler seemed to speak of Erris in almost a whisper, as if the place was cursed. Asenath soon found out why. The two walked through the main drag of town. Despite it being the middle of the day, it was virtually deserted. The only people around were horrifically thin silhouettes that lay under the windows of buildings, lingering somewhere between life and death. The figures were almost naked, wearing just a few patches of rags. Asenath was overcome with a kind of sadness she'd never felt before. She had nothing to give them but prayers. Perhaps one of those figures was Roger or Shannon MacDonald. They paused in the middle of the street as a donkey carrying two skeletal figures on its back glided silently past them. The slow clip-clop of its hooves the only sounds in town to be heard. Asenath wrote of the place, quote, "Whoever turned his eye there needed no other point of observation to see all that famine and pestilence could do." Butler educated her that prior to the famine about 28,000 people lived there. Now there were less than 20,000, 10,000 of which were in the final stages of starvation. Leaving the main street behind, they ventured off into the countryside. Standing atop the rugged, windswept cliffs that rose dramatically from the shore, below the Atlantic Ocean crashed against the rocks, sending sprays of salt water into the air. Behind them lay the remnants of a village. Asenath learned that its inhabitants had been evicted just months earlier. The roofless, mud-brick structures stood in eerie silence, their hollow frames casting long shadows in the afternoon light. Occasionally, figures emerged from the crumbling ruins, a child here, an old man there, like spectres haunting their own past, squatting in the ruins of their old homes. The duo began the sober walk back to their hostel and past a makeshift burial ground. Butler explained that the villagers had neither the physical strength nor money to bury their family, so they just placed a layer of stones atop the bodies. Through a little gap in the stones, Asenath noticed a lock of light brown hair blowing carelessly in the wind. It belonged to a little girl, not yet in her teens. Asenath wrote of it, quote, "They had not room to put her beneath the surface but slightly. A little green grass was pulled and spread over, and then covered with stones. I shall never forget it."
Oh, such a clutch off-season pickup, Dave.
I was worried we'd bring back the same team.
I meant those blackout motorized shades.
Blinds.com made it crazy affordable to replace our old blinds.
Hard to install?
No, it's easy. I installed these and then got some for my mom. She talked to a design consultant for free and scheduled a professional measure and install.
Hall of Fame son.
They're the #1 online retailer of custom window coverings in the world.
Blinds.com is the GOAT.
Shop Blinds.com right now and get up to 45% off select styles. Rules and restrictions may apply.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.
Perhaps at this part of the story, you might assume that with a working blueprint for soup kitchens, maybe we'd be wrapping things up now. With the government relief efforts, perhaps the famine would end here, and the first 2 years could have been chalked up to managerial blunders and a steep learning curve. And this might have been, if not for the Panic of 1847. The Panic of 47 was something like a small-scale stock market crash. The causes of it are still debated today. Some blame speculative railway investments, others point to the Bank of England's tightening of credit, poor harvest, or even Irish loans. Whatever the cause, the result was widespread economic disruption across England. Around 450 banks and businesses declared bankruptcy after they were unable to secure credit. Unemployment shot up, industrial production came to a grinding halt, and food prices rose. Working-class families felt the pinch, as the British Prime Minister wrote to the Irish Viceroy with a dark warning, quote, "I fear you have a most troubling winter ahead, as we have no money." Before the crisis, parliamentarians, humanitarians, and members of the public were within their right to harangue the British government for being stingy with Irish aid. But now, with the financial crisis hurting all levels of society, that argument had become much harder to sustain. Russell's letter was no exaggeration. The British government were in crisis mode. Trevelyan relocated from his family home to a small apartment closer to his office so he could work even longer hours without interruption. He reached out to his old ally, Charles Wood, to discuss what would happen with Ireland. Their proposed solution was one you'd probably expect by this point, with Woods replying to his letter, quote, "They," meaning the Irish, "have hardly been decent while they have found their bellies full of our corn and their pockets full of our money." Woods then penned a letter to the Irish Viceroy, who was becoming increasingly concerned about rebellion within the starving country. Woods set him straight, saying, quote, "Arrest, remand, do anything you can. Send horse, foot, and dragoons. All the world will applaud you," before adding darkly, quote, "And I should not be at all squeamish as to what I did, to the verge of law, and a little beyond." By October 1847, Trevelyan had ordered all soup kitchens in the country closed. In their place, he'd revived the hugely unpopular and ineffective workhouse. Irish property must pay for Irish poverty. Woods and Trevelyan maintained the tired old line that there was money hidden in Ireland, and come hell or high water, they'd find it. Donor fatigue is a phenomenon when people start to give less to charities over time. When grisly and shocking stories fall off the front page of the news, there's a tendency for people to either forget or just become numb to the issue. If donors feel their contributions aren't making a difference, or the scale of the cause is just too great, they drop off. And that's what happened around this part of our story. First the Quakers and now regular donors began pulling back. The British economy was in bad shape, and when times get tough, aid is usually the first budget item to be slashed. Up until this point, the British Relief Association was paying to feed some 200,000 Irish children, but as their donors dried up, they reluctantly discontinued the scheme. Prime Minister Russell announced that he, in good conscience, could not let children starve, and instructed Trevelyan to continue this scheme at the government's expense. Trevelyan cut the relief almost immediately, and doubled down, turning off the tap of the final drips of aid going to the poorest regions of Ireland. Mass evictions recommenced with vigour. Any family in arrears of their rents were shaken down. Confiscations of potato seeds, pulled crops, wooden furniture, even rags of clothes were snatched from starving Irish families who thus far managed to hold on to their house. But no matter what they took, it would never be enough. According to Tim Coogan, the workhouse scheme required £14 million to stay afloat. Irish landlords across the country were burdened with debts amounting to about £10.5 million, leaving them with only £3.5 million in profit. So no matter how you cut it, collecting enough Irish money to cover the costs was quite simply not possible. Sir William Butler, that's another William Butler, not the one Asenath toured Eris with, remembers watching these shakedowns. Growing up in a wealthy Irish family, he lived close enough to one of these wretched villages. Watching the eviction, he recalled, quote, "The sheriff, a strong force of police, and above all, the crowbar brigade, and a body composed of the lowest and most debauched ruffians were present. At a signal from the sheriff, the work began. The miserable inmates of the cabins were dragged out, the thatched roofs were torn down, and the earthen walls battered by crowbars. Practice had made these scoundrels experts in their trade. The screaming women, the half-naked children, the paralysed grandmother, and the tottering grandfather were hauled out. It was a sight I have never forgotten. I was 12 years old at the time, and I think if a loaded gun had been put in my hand, I would have fired into the crowd as they plied their horrible trade. The winter of 1848 lingers in my memory as one long night of sorrow." So many witnesses like this talk about this rage that they felt seeing these evictions happen. Ordinary, peaceful people talk about this desperate longing for a gun or a weapon, something to stop this injustice in front of them. This burning feeling in their very souls telling them what they were witnessing was utterly and morally wrong. Edward Twistleton, the Irish Commissioner for the Poor Law and longtime critic of Trevelyan, wrote to the bureaucrat for a final time asking how he was supposed to feed the masses with no money. Twistleton was a staunch imperialist and confronted Trevelyan with a simple but powerful argument. Britain had annexed Ireland, and with that came responsibility. It was now the Crown's duty to ensure that its subjects did not starve. Quote, "Comparatively trifling sums were required for Britain to spare itself the deep disgrace of permitting its miserable fellow subjects to die of starvation." But Trevelyan was unmoved. Twistleton resigned his position in disgust. This growing frustration was mirrored all across Ireland. Desperation and anger were finally bubbling into outright rebellion. Desperate tenants driven to the edge turned to violence. Landlords became targets, with several shot and others lynched. This wasn't just a time of upheaval in Ireland. Across Europe, the old world of monarchs and emperors was crumbling. In its place, a new order had begun to emerge, one that would shape the modern world we recognise today. During this rebellion, the Irish tricolour was flown for the first time. The flag, with its bold colours of green, orange and white, symbolised a united Ireland. Green for Catholics, orange for Protestants, and white for the peace between them. It was a powerful symbol of Irish unity, and while it was quickly torn down once the British regained control, it would fly again many years later, eventually becoming the Irish flag of today. On a bleak autumn day, a battered, creaking ship limped into New York Harbor. The Trinity, ancient even by the standards of its time, had once carried timber across the seas. Now, hastily and cheaply refitted, it bore a new kind of cargo: human beings. As the ship groaned to a halt at the pier, the figures below deck barely stirred. In the stifling, rancid bowels of the vessel, hundreds of men, women, children, and the elderly were crammed together in suffocating darkness. They were exiles, souls cast out of their dying homeland. Already skeletal from starvation before they'd even boarded, they'd endured weeks adrift with scarcely any food, water, or medicine. Their fate had been sealed not by the seas, but by the whims of Lord Lansdowne, a wealthy landowner whose vast estates in County Kerry had become their prison. For him, their lives were just another commodity. Lansdowne himself had very little, if any, involvement in fitting out the Trinity. He had a man who employed another man to manage his Irish affairs. His directive had been simple: dispose of the destitute, reduce operating expenditure, and bring the balance sheet back into the positives. The cost of sending a peasant abroad was about half the cost of feeding him in a workhouse, so this was to be the directive. And if Lansdowne wanted to save money, there were always corners to be cut to save a few cents. Smaller rations of food, reduction in medicine, a less experienced crew. The British government had decreed a certain level of care had to be provided for each emigrant, but who was going to check? Who would care? Emigration from Ireland was not a new thing. Even before the famine, immigration to America had been on the rise. In 1845, when the famine first hit, skilled, wealthy farmers had sold up their stake and got their family out. By 1846, it was the desperate poorer farmers who begged, borrowed, or bartered their way across the ocean. Some good landlords, like Lord Monteagle, had even paid for their tenants to emigrate. By 1848, the ones being shipped out were society's most vulnerable, the poorest, the elderly, and the utterly destitute. Completely at the mercy of their predatory landlords, these people died by the hundreds. Their bodies, old and wrinkled, or pink and tiny, were tossed overboard somewhere across the Atlantic. Coffin ships is how they came to be known. As a rough wooden gangplank was tethered to the side of the New York harbor, there was no welcoming party for the country's new citizens. Sullen New Yorkers shook their heads and glared as the sickly, near-naked skeletons shuffled off the docks. More gifts from Lansdowne, one of the dock workers remarked to another. Emigrants from the estates owned by Lord Lansdowne were infamous at the port city. Even among other Irish immigrants, these passengers were a pitiful sight. Lansdowne had cut every corner possible to save money. America's War of Independence was still a recent memory at this point of time, so if anyone could relate to British oppression, it was them. But by now New Yorkers were weary of the constant influx of people, disgusted by the sight and smell of the foreigners begging and stealing in their streets. A horrified American doctor described the conditions of one of these coffin ships he inspected at port, quote, "Emaciated, half-nude figures, many with petechial eruptions," that's bleeding under the skin, still disfiguring their faces. Some were just rising from their berths for the first time since leaving Liverpool, having been suffered to lie there all the voyage wallowing in their own filth. One of the last to disembark the Trinity was a thin, dark-haired girl of 23 years old, Cara MacDonald, Roger MacDonald's second oldest daughter. Cara had left the family farm 2 years ago during the second harvest famine. Growing up, she'd never envisioned leaving Ireland. She'd never really thought of leaving Eris, but her father had been insistent that she try and follow Patrick to Liverpool. Rachel, her older sister, was ordered to go with her, but was overwhelmed with guilt at the edge of their village and turned back, giving her sister the little money she'd saved. Cara made it to Dublin, but her money didn't get her far. With no experience in a city, she was quickly relieved of every penny she had. The Dublin soup kitchen kept her alive for a few months, but when Trevelyan closed it, she grew thinner and sicker. Another one of the thousands of beggars swarming the city, she was scooped up and crammed onto the Trinity. Her journey aboard the coffin ship was a nightmare of monotony, filled with the musty stench of sweat and decay. The air was thick with the sounds of constant coughing and the moans of the sick, a grim symphony punctuated by silence and mumbled prayers that followed after each death. Shuffling down the docks of New York, she nursed a severe case of both bronchitis and conjunctivitis, but remembering the corpses of the dead that had been dumped overboard, she knew she had it better than most. There was no Statue of Liberty to welcome her to the grimy port city. Instead, she was pushed brusquely through the processing tent. After a quick check to ensure she didn't have any infectious diseases, she was on the other side, a citizen of America. Disorientated, she was soon scooped up by a friendly Gaelic man who volunteered to show her where to stay. He told her that he was an agent who, out of love for his country, volunteered his services to help paddies like her. Cara had never heard of a paddy before, but soon she would hear it wherever she went. Derived from Patrick, a common Irish name, paddy remains to this day a kind of slur for Irish people. Cara told the agent that she had no money, but with a smile he told her that wasn't a problem. She was in America now, and there was always money to be made. By the end of the day, she had a bed, in a rickety, musky halfway house teetering above the slums of Five Points, Manhattan. The very same slum that Asenath Nicholson had first met the Irish people. Within 2 days, she had a job as a cleaner. It was hard work for low wages, which of course the agent took a huge cut from, but Cara would be one of the lucky ones. America was always seen as the promised land for immigrants, and though people like her would manage to find work, the frustration of the American public was centered around toothless old men and infant children that had been dumped on their doorstep. America did not have an extensive welfare system. There was money to be made if you could work or had a trade, but those who fell through the cracks fell into a life of petty crime and alcoholism. According to Tim Coogan, the 1848 Boston Crime Report saw the following statistic after the mass arrival of Irish immigrants. Complaints for capital offences had increased by 266%, attempts to kill had increased by 1,700%, assaults on police officers had increased 400%, and aggravated assaults had increased 465%. In the coming years, laws became more restrictive on who could and couldn't emigrate to America. As Boston and New York began shutting their doors on arrivals, Canada became a key destination for Irish immigrants. At this point in history, Canada was still in its infancy, a British colony struggling to establish itself. However, colonies always needed labour, and Britain offered generous incentives, including free passage for those who would immigrate. Many Irish families seized this opportunity. Landing in Canada, some chose to settle, but others made the arduous trek south through the wilderness to sneak across the border into America. Australia was usually a last resort. Wild and foreign, the only Irish people down under were the ones who'd been sent there for breaking the law. Barely 70 years old, Australia was a microcosm of England itself, complete with an aristocracy that treated the Irish people as second-class citizens. One of our very old podcast episodes tells the story of Ned Kelly, Australia's most famous outlaw, who was the son of an Irish immigrant and blamed his crime spree on how the British had treated the Irish. So it was that New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, or Boston became the reluctant refuge for the majority of the Irish fleeing their devastated homeland. Living in conditions that few others could endure for wages others wouldn't accept became the grim reality for many Irish immigrants. Crammed into cellars or other makeshift buildings, teetering above alleyways, slaughterhouses, or tanneries. In their new home, life was short and brutal. In Boston, the child mortality rate for Irish Catholics reached a staggering 61.5, meaning nearly 2 out of 3 children died before their 5th birthday. In such desperate conditions, drink became the Irish curse. Grog shops flourished, selling bathtub whiskies as a way to numb the profound loss of culture, family, and identity. Excluded from mainstream society, the Irish stuck to their own neighbourhoods. As rain poured down, the sounds of drunken laughter, shouting, and sobbing mixed with the twang of banjos and crude violins as they sang songs of loss, hope, and their uncertain future. Ancestors of future President John F. Kennedy and industrial visionary Henry Ford rose from this humble, struggling community to shape the future of their new home. One of my favourite songs, written a few years after the famine, is called Revenge for Skibbereen. Skibbereen is a town in County Cork in Ireland's southwest, and the song tells the story of a son asking his elderly father why he left Ireland. Part of the lyrics go like this, quote, "Oh, it's well I do remember that bleak December day. The landlord and the sheriff came to drive us all away. They set my roof on fire with their demon yellow spleen, and that's another reason why I left old Skibbereen. Your mother too, God rest her soul, lay on the snowy ground. She fainted over in anguish with the desolation round. She never rose but passed away from life to a mortal dream, and found a quiet grave, my boy, in dear old Skibbereen." The song concludes with his son swearing to his father to avenge what was done to Ireland. Quote, "O father dear, the day will come when vengeance loud will call, and we will rise with Erin's boys to rally one and all. I'll be the man to lead the van beneath our flag of green, and loud and high will the cry, Revenge for Skibbereen."
Need a little help? O'Reilly Auto Parts can help. Need advice? We've got advice. No matter what you need, we have thousands of professional parts people doing their part to make sure you have it. Exceptional customer service. Just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Hey, podcast listeners, I'm Paul Brandis introducing my podcast, Countdown to Dallas. It's a fascinating, in-depth look at the seemingly unconnected events that led to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It's based on my book of the same title. In that book and in this podcast, I go all the way back to 1939, when Lee Harvey Oswald was born into a troubled and dysfunctional family. I'll follow his transient and often violent teenage years and young adulthood, painting a fuller picture of the man who would later become Kennedy's killer. I also take a look at events unfolding in that era, like Cuba and Vietnam, and I'll unpack the conspiracy theories too, not one of which has ever been conclusively proven. Subscribe to Countdown to Dallas at evergreenpodcasts.com or your favorite listening app, October 31st.
In the year 1851, a 22-year-old Patrick MacDonald stepped off a stagecoach onto the windswept soil of Eris. With him was his wife, Lily, and their 2 young children. He took a long, deep breath, drawing in the cold Atlantic air. It smelled like home. Patrick, Roger MacDonald's eldest son, had left Eris years ago to find work in Liverpool at the onset of the famine. He'd managed to secure a job, get married, and start a family of his own. From the moment he earned his first paycheck, he'd sent money back home, but he'd never received a reply. The stagecoach driver began to offer directions, but Patrick waved him off with a smile. He didn't need them. He knew the way home. He followed the rough dirt path he'd walked 1,000 times before, winding his way to where his family's little house had once stood. His heart sank when he reached the end. His father's small potato field was gone, swallowed up by an enormous pig farm stretching across what felt like the entire county. He never imagined he'd have trouble finding the spot where his house stood, but nothing looked the same. He paced alongside the fence, searching for a sign of the life he'd left behind. Maybe, just maybe, at the end of the field he'd find their little cottage, untouched by time. Perhaps he'd see cheerful plumes of smoke rising from the chimney, and his mother would call him in, laughing as she welcomed him home. He imagined his siblings, older now, crowding around him, eager to hear of his adventures. But there was nothing. After an hour of fruitless searching, Patrick reluctantly agreed to call it a day and head back to town. As he climbed back over the pig fence, his foot snagged something. Glancing down, he saw it. A tiny wooden cross, crudely fashioned from 2 small branches. A grave marker. His breath caught in his throat as he knelt down, recognizing it instantly. It was the cross his father had made for his little sister, Imogen. He stared at it, frozen in place, as the cold, salty breeze whispered through the empty pig pens. The Great Hunger officially ended in the year 1852. We'll probably never know just how many died during those 7 years, but most historians put the number somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million deaths from starvation or related diseases. Around 1 in 8 people in Ireland. Families living in the western regions, like the MacDonalds, whose story has been fictionalized for the sake of this episode, were amongst the hardest hit by the famine. In some areas, as much as 30% of the population was lost. In total, England spent around £8 million on famine relief over the 8-year period, or about £700 million in 2024, according to bankofengland.co.uk. This sounds like a lot until you hear from historian Peter Gray, who points out that this was less than 0.5% of British GDP during the period. For comparison, the Crimean War cost Britain almost £64 million. So the money was there, but why wasn't it spent? The 1800 Act of Union meant Ireland was officially part of Great Britain, but even so it was still seen as a foreign body, an other. Imagine if a famine of this scale took place in Liverpool or even Wales or Scotland. The difference in responses would have been night and day. And so it brings us to the question of genocide. Did England's actions or inactions meet the definition of genocide? The United Nations article defines genocide as A. Killing members of the group, B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The strongest argument could be made for point C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Charles Trevelyan, with the support from figures like Charles Wood, implemented policies deliberately designed to reduce the Irish population, with the goal of modernising the country through high farming. At the very least, Prime Minister Russell and his government are guilty of not doing more to overrule them. In the years following the famine, Charles Trevelyan remained restless and relentless. The potato blight soon spread north and made its way to Scotland, and Trevelyan, seeing how well the Irish emigration had worked out, set up a scheme to ship destitute Scots to Australia. Scots, like Irish, had Celtic ancestry, which Trevelyan considered a racial impurity. Great Britain was better off without them, or at least with less of them. When pushed on this policy, he took to his podium stating, quote, 500 years hence, a few of the most aristocratic families of the great Australian Republic will boast of being able to trace their ancestors in the Highland Emigration Book of 1852 to 1853. For his quote-unquote contribution to the famine, Trevelyan was knighted into the Order of Bath. For the remainder of his life, he worked as the Governor of India before returning to London and dying aged 79. His great-great-great-granddaughter, Laura Trevelyan, worked at the BBC for 30 years before retiring in 2023 to become a full-time advocate for slavery reparations. In May 2023, she said she was open to the idea of reparations for Ireland, acknowledging that her ancestor had, quote, failed their people. Prime Minister John Russell continued in politics for the next 2 decades or so. His tenure is usually remembered for his efforts to try and expand liberties and freedom for the working classes. His disastrous policies in Ireland remain as the largest blemish on an otherwise benevolent political career. Though he was the Prime Minister for most of the Irish famine, Russell should not be vilified in the same light as Trevelyan or Wood. Numerous times throughout the famine he trialled new methods to alleviate the suffering but was blocked again and again by his cabinet or the British Parliament. He could have done more, but he also could have done less. Russell died in 1878. Asenath Nicholson remained in Ireland until August 1848. Though the famine still raged, there were signs in her writing that the suffering and death that had become her surroundings were taking its toll on her psyche. As her final days ticked down on the country that had become her surrogate home, she agonized about whether she'd really done all she could. Her diary entries become more erratic as she recalls incidents where some of the food she'd put aside for herself could have been given to others. After 4 long years in Ireland, perhaps she quietly wiped away tears as she made her way to the Dublin Quay to depart the Emerald Isle forever. Before she could board, though, she encountered Mary, the woman she'd taken in and taught to sew during the height of the famine. Perhaps she got some relief seeing Mary well dressed and knowing that she'd found employment. As the thick plumes of black smoke poured from the steamliner chugging away from Dublin, she penned the final entry in her numerous journals about Ireland, concluding her travels with, quote, Ireland, I still love thee. Asenath settled in New Jersey, USA, and died about 7 years later at age 63. The Times newspaper, by far the most influential and widely read publication, only grew in popularity following the famine. The divisive paper continued to wield enormous influence over public opinion, and any politician with the ears of its editor, like Trevelyan or Woods, became highly influential, capable of swaying the masses. As the famine subsided, the paper shifted its focus, dramatically declaring that English identity was under threat from the influx of Irish immigrants flooding their cities. This sensational rhetoric fueled fear and division, shaping public attitudes and deepening resentment towards the Irish. Over the years, the paper changed hands multiple times before ultimately falling under the control of News Corp and Rupert Murdoch. Murdoch, a media tycoon notorious for exploiting division and spreading hate, continues to use his vast media empire to undermine democratic processes and reshape political landscapes to serve his own interests. As the 1850s rolled onwards, Ireland slowly recovered, but it was a different country to the one that went into the famine. According to a published article by Asenath Watson, an associate professor at the University College of Dublin, the Irish language, already in decline before the famine, rapidly fell out of use. With mass emigration to English-speaking countries like Canada or the United States, there was just no need to speak anything apart from English. According to the same author, prior to the famine, about half the country's population were bilingual, but spoke Irish as their language of choice, while about 10% of the country could only speak Irish. By 1911, about 70 years after the famine, just 17.6% of people could understand Irish. Worse still, it had become a language of paupers, only spoken by impoverished farmers and remote townsfolk. The ancient language was in terminal decline. But on the 6th of December 1921, Ireland achieved its long sought-after independence from Britain. The predominantly Protestant northeast region became Northern Ireland, remaining part of the United Kingdom, while the rest of the island became the Irish Free State, marking the beginning of a new chapter in Irish history. Desperate to rebuild their culture, the Irish language was thrust back into national spotlight, but it was too late to turn back the clock. Despite monumental government efforts that continue to this day, UNESCO classifies the Irish language as definitely endangered. According to a 2016 census, about 4% of people spoke Irish daily as their main method of communication. I thought it might be nice to hear what this ancient language sounds like, so here's a little sample.
Díhíh sibhónna híháin sanam dumsa. Is as cúnta hiúí mé ó thuchas, teh mod an dagan maríoch neclabalan na náil. Há coníra man nuárach, ach níor honna medíirech ón maríg nuárach. Cha mé cuipiana I black lia, chomer Arnold Scollins son.
I've always found Celtic languages fascinating. To know that in 2024 people are yelling over microphones on Fortnite the same words that people had been speaking as they saw Caesar's legions sailing onto the English shore is just surreal. And it raises an important question. How much effort should you invest in learning and using a language simply because it's part of your cultural heritage? There's no one-size-fits-all answer, it depends on the individual. But with the Irish government continuing to air television programs in Irish, and platforms like Duolingo making the language more accessible, perhaps Irish can survive, even if it's just through sayings, jokes, or a few words woven into everyday conversation. As Ireland continued to navigate the rocky waters of early nationhood, the shared trauma of the famine became inseparable from their national identity. A framed thank you letter in the archives of Turkey still exists from 1849, written by Irish representatives to thank the Sultan for his financial aid during their struggle. Even more touching is the Kindred Feathers statue built in County Cork to commemorate the eternal friendship between the people of Ireland and the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. The statue, featuring translucent steel feathers curved into the shape of a bowl to symbolize food, was unveiled in 2017 by Gary Batten, chief of the Oklahoma Choctaws. In both the US and Canada, various sculptures and plaques exist to commemorate the famine. The Irish diaspora in these countries remain insistent that such a defining moment of their history should never be forgotten. One monument I found quite moving is located on Grosser Isle, a small island nestled in the Lawrence River in Quebec, Canada. This tranquil spot was home to a horrific quarantine station where thousands of immigrants arrived despite the facility being only intended for a few hundred. Today, a towering Celtic cross stands watch over the sea, where thousands of sick and starving Irish people gazed out from its shores, waiting desperately to be processed and offered the chance at a new life. At its base, the plaque reads, quote, "In this secluded spot lie the mortal remains of 5,425 persons who, flying from pestilence and famine in the year 1847, found in North America but a grave." Slowly but surely, the Irish who migrated and the ones that stayed behind began to rebuild their lives. In the USA, the Irish became a force to be reckoned with. Coming together for protection against a hostile public, they joined labour unions and fought tirelessly for their right to earn a living wage and preserve their culture. America's expanding industry was built on the backs of Irishmen, known for their habits of hard working, hard drinking, and hard praying. Their culture significantly influenced many cities, giving them a unique identity that remains evident today. Ken Casey, lead singer of Irish-inspired punk rock band Dropkick Murphys, immortalized this pull-no-punches attitude in the band's very first EP, Boys on the Docks, where he sung about his uncle, a dock worker and representative for other Irishmen, quote, "Say hey Johnny boy, the battle calls. United we stand, divided we fall. Together we are what we can't be alone. We came to this country. You made it our home." Ireland's road to reconciliation with England was a slow and difficult one. For decades, the famine remained largely unacknowledged or discussed in England, fueling resentment and lingering tensions in Ireland. From the 1960s to the turn of the millennium, a period known as the Troubles was marked by bombings, murders and kidnappings across Northern Ireland, often spilling into England or Europe. The perpetrators of these acts were driven by a fury over the suffering of their people, a pain that had never been properly acknowledged. It wasn't until 1998 when British Prime Minister Tony Blair first expressed remorse on behalf of his country that the relationship began to improve. In a televised speech from County Cork where once throngs of starving skeletons moaned at empty soup kitchens of an uncaring British government, Blair admitted, quote, "Those who governed in London failed their people by standing by, while a crop failure turned into a massive human tragedy." A year later, Blair became the first Prime Minister to speak at the Irish Parliament. Addressing a parliamentary body that had been created in defiance of Britain, Blair focused on the similarities of the two nations rather than the differences, noting, quote, "Like it or not, we, the British and the Irish, are irredeemably linked. We experienced and absorbed the same waves of invasions. Celts, Vikings, Normans, all left their distinctive marks on our countries. Sadly, the power games of medieval monarchs and feudal chiefs sowed the seeds of later trouble. Down through the centuries, Ireland and Britain have inflicted too much pain, each on the other. But now the UK and Ireland, as two modern countries, can try and put our histories behind us, try to forgive and forget those age-old enmities. We have both grown up now. A new generation is in power in each country. Our two countries can look to the future with confidence in our separate ways, but we will be stronger and more prosperous, working together. Today, in a post-Brexit world, Ireland's future is again dotted with uncertainty. But as Tim Coogan wrote at the end of his book, quote, "It's not unreasonable to hope that a country that could weather the trauma described can also emerge with some strength from its current difficulties. A land that could survive the famine can survive almost anything." This has been Anthology of Heroes. Thanks for listening. A huge thanks to our show patrons, both old and new, and a big hug to our Justinian tier members, Sarah, John K, John H, Doug, Angus, Claudia, Sam, Tom, and Seth. Thanks guys, and see you on the next one.
I'm Allison Holland, host of the Kennedy Dynasty podcast. Equipped with a microphone and a long-term fascination of the Kennedy family, I am joined by an incredible cast of experts, friends, and guests to take you on a fun, relaxed, yet informative journey through history and pop culture. From book references to fashion to philanthropy to our modern expectations of the presidency itself, you'll see that there is so much more to Kennedy than just JFK or conspiracy theories. Join me for the Kennedy Dynasty podcast.
Hi everyone, I want to invite you to check out History Shorts Podcast's 5-day countdown to the 2024 presidential election, with a slew of special guests and some presidential trivia. Our special guests include Mr. Max Boot, Pulitzer Prize finalist and author of the New York Times bestseller, Reagan, His Life and Legend; David Petrusha, author and authority on the history of U.S. presidential elections; presidential historian Dr. Lindsay Travinsky; and Ken Kachigan, Presidents Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan's speechwriter. I hope you guys check it out and continue to tune in for daily fun history at www.historyshortspodcast.com or wherever you get your shows.